Hello and welcome to Nature Connects, the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, influencers, and partners from New England and around the world. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Sarles, a TNC Massachusetts trustee, your host for the next hour. Here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthier world for all. We work locally and globally, using innovative science and scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. We know that what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for people and the planet. We have an exciting program for you today. We'll hear from Steve Cohn, State Director of TNC Alaska. Steve will speak about the Alaska chapter's work in the incomparable Bristol Bay. He'll give the story behind the fight to protect a way of life and a healthy environment, build a sustainable local economy, and nurture traditions that date back millennia. You'll hear about the notorious Pebble Mine, a zombie mine as I call it, because it just won't die, even though it very much deserves to. Today is exciting for me because I've had the chance to see TNC's Alaska work firsthand in different parts of the vast state. The Tongass, Matsu, Lake Clark, but not yet Bristol Bay, as my plans to visit there during summer 2020 fell victim to the global pandemic. Before we commence today's program, I want to introduce our featured speaker. Steve Cohn joined the Nature Conservancy in 2018 after a distinguished 16-year career in the Federal Bureau of Land Management, where he successfully served as Deputy State Director for Resources in Alaska. Steve holds a bachelor's degree in government from Harvard University, so he's no stranger to the Massachusetts area, and advanced degrees from the College of Natural Resources at the University of California at Berkeley. Steve will present for roughly 20 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes for questions and answers. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit your query. Before we start, let's watch a video of this amazing place.
Thank you, Dan, and the Massachusetts team. It's so great to see you this morning, and thank you for inviting us here to talk today. I'd like to take the next 20 minutes to talk about the work we're doing here in the state in Alaska and how we feel our work here is making a global impact, securing nature, not just for Alaskans, but for all of us that value this special place and all that it provides the world. I hold deep personal and professional connections to Alaska, and some of you may too. And even if Alaska only seems like a remote bucket list dream, it actually has a huge impact on all our lives. Let me share a few statistics. Did you know that 95% of the wild salmon consumed in the United States is caught in Alaska? That Alaska harvests 60% of the nation's seafood, or that 95% of the nation's remaining intact lands and waters are located here. As Dan mentioned, I lived in Massachusetts for 4 years as a college student, and so I know how important the connection to the ocean is for New Englanders. And so I know that Alaska and our talk about Alaska today is going to be important for all of you. As our planet's health is increasingly uncertain, Alaska's lands and waters will play a key role in protecting nature and people. TNC as an organization is excited about the Biden administration's 30 by 30 goals, which aim at conserving 30% of the country's land and waters by 2030. We believe Alaska has a very important role to play in helping to achieve these goals. For decades, TNC's worked throughout the state to protect and restore Alaska's most critical fish and wildlife habitats. For example, this is our work here in the Tongass National Forest in Southeast Alaska. The Tongass is the largest coastal temperate rainforest in the country and the most significant forest in terms of carbon storage in the country. Our goal in the Tongass is ensuring that this carbon sequestering old growth forest, so critical to our future and our global climate work, is co-managed with local and indigenous communities so that cultures, economies, and nature can all thrive, all dependent on that forest ecosystem. Last November, the Bezos Earth Fund invested in the Emerald Edge, which is our work in Southeast Alaska, coastal British Columbia, and the northwest coast of Washington State, including our work in the Tongass. So if you have a chance, if you can tune into the Massachusetts presentation next Thursday, you'll learn more about our work, working with Indigenous and community partners in the Tongass, and some amazing recent developments we're excited to share with you. So Bristol Bay, very similar to the Tongass, is one of several places in Alaska that we feel is of global importance, where biodiversity, intact ecosystems, and Indigenous-led conservation present opportunities for large-scale impact. I'll talk about this more throughout the presentation. There's a broad coalition of local organizations that have really been leading the way for over 2 decades on conservation in Bristol Bay. And throughout that time, they've teamed up with national nonprofits like TNC. If this coalition is successful, up to 10 million acres of state lands and waters could be protected from future unsustainable mining, a permanent endowment created to support sustainable economic development for the region, and the 7,500 people from Bristol Bay would have increased authority over resource management, decision-making, and community self-determination. So I'd like now to share with you a video that was filmed by one of our trustees, Norm Van Vactor. Norm lives in Dillingham in the western part of Bristol Bay and works in the commercial fishing industry. And he literally taped a GoPro to the wing of his small plane. He's also an amateur pilot. And so what you see here are the waters supporting the last thriving wild sockeye run on the planet. The Bristol Bay watershed spans 44,000 square miles, an ecologically intact landscape roughly the size of Ohio, and an average annual run of over 50 million sockeye salmon. In fact, all 5 species of Pacific salmon return here each year to these streams. Bristol Bay is also the home to 31 Alaska Native tribes, representing 3 distinct cultures, Yupik, Dena'ina, and Alutiiq peoples, who've thrived in Bristol Bay since time immemorial. Their cultures and livelihoods are linked inextricably to the land, water, and salmon. Half of the world's supply of wild sockeye salmon comes from the Bristol Bay watershed, half, sustaining a $2 billion global industry. This year, for example, has been an amazing year for Bristol Bay, one of the highest on record. More than 65 million fish, sockeye salmon, returned to the watershed as part of their life cycle. And literally, these salmon sustain an entire way of life for this region, as well as that incredibly important commercial fishery. So I'd like to give you a chance to meet Norm a little bit. Norm recorded this video from standing next to his airplane in Bristol Bay, and he wants to share a little bit more about why Bristol Bay streams are so important to him.
Greetings, my name is Norman Van Vactor, and this is my granddaughter Freya. We're speaking to you live from Bristol Bay, Alaska. Specifically, our hometown is here in Dillingham, where I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Bristol Bay Economic Development Corporation. We've had just an incredible year. Close to 66 million sockeye salmon will return to the 5 tributaries that make up Bristol Bay. We truly have so much to be grateful for. We're also grateful for the work that you folks are doing on the East Coast. So from those of us in Alaska to you, again, we hope you have a great meeting and all the best. And we thank you for helping us protect our salmon. Right, Freya?
Protect your salmon, please.
Protect our
So, as I hope you can begin to see why Bristol Bay is so important. And, one of the reasons that Bristol Bay, when we talk about it being the last stronghold for salmon in the world, in North America certainly, and if not the world, is because we've lost our salmon ecosystems virtually everywhere else on the planet. It is now half of our wild sockeye salmon because we no longer have all of the other streams that used to be so productive. This system is at risk. Unfortunately, Bristol Bay also contains vast stores of minerals beneath these world-class streams, like the well-known Pebble deposit. If developed, the Pebble mine would be one of the largest open pit mines in the world, located at the spawning grounds for fully 50% of Bristol Bay's sockeye salmon. So in effect, threatening a quarter of the world's remaining wild sockeye salmon runs. And our experience with these kinds of mines around the world has demonstrated that the risk of permanent and irreparable harm to this unique place is simply too great to consider. As Alaska's Senator Ted Stevens once famously said, "I am not opposed to mining, but Pebble is the wrong mine for the wrong place." So TNC has conducted over 2 decades of science in the region. And this is one of the more recent works we did leading up to the Army Corps' decision on the federal permit, which I'll talk about in a bit. This modeling revealed that a failure of the dams at Pebble Mine would release toxic waste throughout the entire watershed, contaminating habitat and lakes that provide local drinking water, likely flowing clear out to the bay. In addition, operation of the mine would produce billions of gallons of contaminated toxic wastewater that would need to be stored and treated in perpetuity. These toxic tailings, as they're called, would be stored in earthen dams, unproven at this scale, in an area that is seismically active and flood prone. So what you're looking at is the model that we produced of a sort of a visual image of the model that would happen if there was a catastrophic dam failure. This is a very real possibility. We've seen this time and again in other mines around the world. An accident of this kind would devastate irreplaceable fish and wildlife habitat for hundreds of miles downstream and could flood virtually all salmon habitat clear out to the bay. But it is not all doom and gloom. And so what we would like to leave you with today is hope. We don't feel like the situation is dire anymore. In fact, we feel positive that we've got a real opportunity here. In November of 2020, in a surprise decision based on irrefutable science that TNC and others contributed to over many years, the United States Army Corps of Engineers denied the federal permit for Pebble Mine in Bristol Bay. This was a surprise and a real critical milestone for people in nature here, especially the Alaska Native leadership and the commercial fishing industry who have been fighting this mine literally for a generation. So this is extremely positive, and we want to focus on that, the proactive nature of the moment we're in now, but we also want to keep an eye looking over our shoulder at the threat and making sure we don't lose sight of that, because we've been through this before. In 2014, we thought that the mine was dead, only to be resurrected during the last administration and to nearly get a federal permit. The specter of Pebble Mine will continue to rise until the region is permanently protected by statute. The scale of this fight and the importance of this special place is of national and even global concern. And so we feel that everyone can play a part working with us in protecting Bristol Bay today while investing in its future. So the good news is we have positive momentum and the kind of opportunity to end a threat of large-scale mining in the region that we couldn't have envisioned even a year ago. There's high profile and bipartisan opposition to the mine, the recent permit denial, and a very favorable new federal administration provide an unparalleled opportunity to protect this watershed. Under a Biden-Harris administration, we can now expect to transition from a defensive strategy to proactive efforts for permanent protection and community development. So let me give you a little bit more specifics. TNC is invested in Bristol Bay for the long term. Our conservation work in the region falls under two key strategies. The first is lasting and durable protection in Bristol Bay. So we're working closely with partners in the region on the ultimate long-term solution, advancing federal and state legislation to permanently retire Pebble's subsurface mineral rights. The scale of this is unprecedented. In addition to creating an endowment for sustainable economic and community development, this would allow for the state of Alaska to be fully compensated for not developing this mineral deposit. Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski has publicly pledged to take further congressional action to protect the Bristol Bay region. And we and our partners are working with Senator Murkowski and other allies in the Senate to get legislation introduced soon. Here in Alaska with TNC, we also brought on a lobbying firm to help us with the state legislature in Juneau. The Pebble mine deposit itself is owned by the state, so we believe engaging at the federal and the state level will be critical to our success. In addition, with the Biden administration publicly in support of permanent protection, we are advocating for a Clean Water Act veto as well. This would allow the US EPA to use its authority to further deny a permit for the mine. And finally, we're also helping in several efforts to block mining access through private land investments on the north and south sides of Lake Iliamna, the key access points to the mine, following the lead of our Indigenous partners. Our second strategy is around sustainable communities and Indigenous Guardians program. We really feel this is our most important long-term effort, working with regional partners to attract investments for sustainable, diversified economies and community development as an alternative to mining. TNC has a lot of experience working this way in Alaska. For decades, we've done the same kind of work in Southeast Alaska, attracting community investments to ensure sustainable development, long-term prosperity, and Indigenous cultural vitality as an alternative to old growth logging. Again, if you tune in to next Thursday's presentation on the Seacoast Trust, you'll hear more about how this kind of work has touched down in the Tongass. A major component of this strategy is building capacity for Indigenous stewardship to monitor, manage, and steward lands and waters, and to increase opportunities for co-management of state and federal lands while also creating jobs. Another is building the leadership capacity of young people, young leaders, so that they're better able to assert their voices and rights in natural resource management decision-making. Lastly, we are also advancing policies to curb the loss of commercial fishing permits that have left the region and to make it easier for young local fishermen to access the funding they need to participate in this lucrative commercial fishery. And I will say that this is a work we've been doing around the state, and we are working very closely with some partners from Massachusetts where similar work has been done. And so there really is I feel a strong connection between our work in Alaska and our work in New England. Here in Alaska, we're a really big state with a really small population. But as Alaska shows time and time again, investments here can make a massive impact toward our national, even our global conservation goals. For a healthy future, the world literally needs Alaska, and Alaska needs the help of folks like yourselves. Thank you for welcoming us today to talk with you. about this urgent need and this opportunity. And I'm looking forward to engaging further as we get into questions and answers. I will share that we are actively fundraising for this work in Bristol Bay, as well as other projects in Alaska. If you are inspired by this work, I would ask that you would join us in our fight to protect Bristol Bay and consider making a gift. We are very fortunate that 2 generous donors have created a match where gifts of $10,000 or more to the Alaska chapter in support of this work will be matched dollar for dollar, doubling the impact that you can make on conservation. Gifts at all levels are appreciated. In the chat is a link you can click if you want to support our chapter. Also, if you want to find out more about the match mentioned above, you can email Todd. His email's in the chat. And if you want to find out more about the work we're doing and get updates about Bristol Bay, the Tongass, and other activities in the state, the last link in the chat will allow you to sign up for TNC Alaska emails. And please stay tuned. If and when legislation gets introduced, we are going to need everyone to call their senators and to get a bill passed in this Congress.
Steve, thank you so much for sharing about TNC's incredible work in Bristol Bay. I know I learned a lot, and I'm enthusiastic as ever to get back to Alaska and see some of this work in person someday. Now let's turn to audience questions, and just as a reminder to attendees, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Start with one sort of connecting Massachusetts or New England and Alaska. We know the New England shellfish industry was hit hard by the global pandemic. Sort of curious, how has the pandemic impacted salmon fishing in Alaska? You're on mute, Steve.
Sorry, turn up my mute. It's a great question. Yeah, I think we've probably seen some very similar effects. This summer was much better, certainly, but certainly last summer, COVID really impacted Alaska fishing communities in a couple of ways. I mean, it impacted the markets. There was a real slowdown in demand for seafood in general, and that really impacted the price and demand for Alaska's wild-caught seafood. And also Alaska's rural communities are very remote. They don't have easy access to healthcare, and so there's a lot of concern about COVID and if it would get brought into these communities. And so there was a lot of fear around that, and a lot of precautions were taken to try to keep COVID out of communities. But it made it for a very difficult fishing season. But I do think things are improving, but it's still tenuous. And we're seeing how much even places as remote as Bristol Bay are not an island and are still very much affected by what's going on in the rest of the globe.
Great. Question from former Massachusetts board chair Tom Jones. Who are the forces, corporations, developers, et cetera, behind projects like Pebble Mine? And what is the general appetite among Alaskan voters for projects such as this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So 2 parts to that. So first, this has been part of the frustration, I think, of Pebble, the Pebble Mine fight. Is, as I mentioned, the mineral deposit itself is owned by the state of Alaska. It's a long story of how they acquired that, but basically it was an outcome of the Alaska Statehood Act that allowed the new state, to select land and resources for the development of the state's economy. And so these lands were selected by the state, the mineral interests came with them, and then they made those minerals available for private entities to explore and potentially develop these minerals. The company that currently owns the deposit, or owns the lease rights, I should say, for the state's mineral deposit, is a very small Canadian-owned, what's referred to as a junior mining company. So they have very few real assets. They don't have any major mining development going on anywhere. and they're a real high risk operation. They over the several decades that this fight has been going on, there have been large mining companies that have invested literally hundreds of millions of dollars into exploration, research around impacts, permitting. They all left. They all pulled out of the project because at a certain point they all realized that the stakes here are way too high, and the potential impacts are so great that the liability of this kind of project is really really too much for any serious mining company. Now, the state of Alaska, currently, the current governor is very pro-mining. He has been a very strong vocal supporter of the Pebble project. So we have a lot of work to do to try to overcome his resistance. We feel favorable, however, in a couple ways. One, the majority of Alaskans consistently in polling have opposed this project, which is very unusual for Alaska. Alaska thinks of itself as a mining state, an oil and gas development state. So having a majority of Alaskans opposed to this is really unique. And so we feel emboldened that we can really push through legislation at the state level. And I do think the other aspect of what we're looking at, I mentioned that part of the proposal here that's under consideration would be for the United States to acquire the mineral rights from the state through an exchange, but basically to a cash settlement that would alleviate the concerns that the state is somehow not going to get benefit from this valuable mineral deposit because it would provide for a real return to the state. And the way we're looking at it potentially is that those funds that the state would receive could go into a university trust fund and also a trust fund for the sustainable economic development of the region of Bristol Bay. So it's really it would be a win-win all around. The United States, we would acquire these minerals. They would be retired from any future mineral development under federal law, and the state of Alaska would get compensation and would go towards some very, very needed revenue streams in the state. So we think that all told should be able to put together a winning coalition that could even overcome this governor's resistance.
Great, thanks for that, Steve. Sort of a connected question from Shirley Griffin. Do local Alaskan legislators all support ending the possibility of mining in Bristol Bay? And the more important, or second or follow-on question, as oil production falls and with it state income, might legislators turn to mining as an income source? And there's sort of connected to that another question about threats in to Bristol Bay beyond just Pebble Mine. Are there other mines? Is there other oil and gas? And connected to Shirley's question about how durable, I guess, is some of that broad opposition? Could challenges come up that make that opposition, reduce that opposition and have Pebble Mine reemerge again?
Yeah, I mean, those are all very good questions. And that is one of the reasons that we really want to focus on legislation right now, because we need permanence and we need permanent protection. That was a lesson we learned in 2014. I mean, we are also pushing forward very strongly on a Clean Water Act veto with the Biden administration, which is a stronger permit denial than what the Army Corps decision they released in November, but it is not permanent. That can also be overturned by a future administration. So we do feel like this is the moment we need to secure permanent legislative protection. Let me address a few of there's a few really good questions in there. So, not everyone is of the same mind, certainly on the project, including at the local level. There are people in Bristol Bay, there's leadership in Bristol Bay at a tribal level, at a corporate level that favors the mine because of the economic development that it would bring and the job opportunities that it would bring. There's also I would say a majority of leadership in Bristol Bay, and the people themselves through surveys have shown this. The large majority of residents of Bristol Bay oppose the mine. They don't see this as a good part of their sustainable future. A $2 billion fishing industry is worth a lot more than a handful of jobs that this mine would provide. It's a great question about the future of the state and the relationship with oil and gas and how that might affect other sectors. There's a lot of dialogue going on in the state right now. I think there is a growing recognition that basing the state's economic future on oil and gas is not prudent. Certainly the market forces and the political pressures are moving in a direction where we're probably not going to see a lot of new major oil and gas developments in the state. There's still, I would anticipate oil and gas development and production still being a part of the state's future for decades, just because it's there's so much momentum there. But I think the trend is certainly going to be moving away from that direction. So people are asking the question, what comes next? That's one of the reasons in our proposal, we're looking to create a permanent endowment for the university and for regional economic development, recognizing that state revenues from oil and gas are probably going to keep going down. So we do need to find a way to fund important services like a university, and a permanent endowment would really help towards that end. I think there's a lot of dialogue in the state about alternative economic futures that are less extractive and based more on sustainable economic activity, like tourism, like fisheries, like investments in broadband and more connectivity to a global economy. Alaska, in a lot of ways, is it's a resource-rich state, but the economic development of the state has really been largely dictated by external interests in an extractive kind of way. And so leaders in the state, around the state, are really thinking of new ways to envision a sustainable future for Alaska that is less extractive and invests more in its people and more in a sustainable economic base.
Great. Some questions, when it comes to definitions. Carly Abrams asked, what does ecologically intact mean? And it's a good point. A lot of times we throw that around, but what is when it comes to Bristol Bay, what does that actually mean, and why it makes it so special?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I think of that phrase, I think of a place that really has minimal where there's been minimal development of any kind in that landscape. So the areas, there are very few roads, very few power lines, very few the landscape itself is not fragmented. It is intact. All the functions and processes that we think of, ecosystem processes, are fully connected. That's the reason why this region produces such amazing productivity, not just for salmon, but for many hundreds of species, and is also a very important ecosystem for migratory birds flying from all around the world, pass through Bristol Bay. A lot of Alaska really falls into this category of ecologically intact because we have so many large landscapes in the state that don't have roads or other kinds of major developments. There are communities throughout Bristol Bay, but they're smaller, and they're also they're not connected generally by roads, and so the surrounding ecosystems are largely intact. And I guess I could let me just make the point a little further that most of the salmon that we consume, or much of the salmon that's consumed around the globe, is not wild salmon. It's either farm raised or fish that start off in hatcheries. Bristol Bay is unique. You know, when 65 million fish came back to Bristol Bay this summer, those fish were all, you know, the eggs for those fish were all spawned in streams by wild salmon. There was no human intervention in that at all. And so it's a pretty amazing system that for 120 years, we've been able to harvest fish commercially, as well as for local subsistence needs sustainably. It continues to produce this amazing productivity. And literally all we need to do is just not mess it up. And we can anticipate that it'll continue to be productive for a long time. So that, to me, that's what makes it ecologically intact. It's a whole system.
Great, no, great answer. Thank you. Two questions I get, both sort of connected to the federal position on this. The first is, can you give some details as to why a Clean Water Act veto, just the Clean Water Act, why that would help? And then you mentioned Senator Murkowski, but Wes Milligan asked, what is the position of your remaining congressional delegation on the Pebble Mine project? How does that impact the potential of federal action? So both of those sort of connecting to, at the federal level, what's happening.
Yeah, great questions. So the Clean Water Act has a rarely used component to it. It's what's referred to as, it's Section 404C of the Clean Water Act, which allows for the US EPA in a case where it's documented that there would be irreparable harm from a project to override any other permitting authority, in this case, the US Army Corps of Engineers, with their Clean Water Act authorities. And even if the Army Corps were to issue a permit, the EPA could veto that. And it's rarely used. I think it's only been used about a dozen times or so since the Clean Water Act was passed. And it's a pretty high bar to overcome. So if we're unsuccessful with legislation, we want to make sure we don't leave this administration without a more durable kind of protective measure. This is basically the most protective decision we could have at the administrative level. But again, it is not as permanent as what we're thinking about with legislation. You know, the vehicle we're looking at with legislation, there's a mechanism to compensate the state, and we would withdraw those minerals from entry under the mining law. That's the same mechanism that is used when national parks are created. So the state would still own the surface lands and still have the ability to manage for fishing game and other surface uses. But most importantly, the area would not be open to mining claims. And that again is the same measure that's used to protect national parks. Senator Murkowski has certainly been the leader when thinking about legislation, but she is not alone. Our other senator, Dan Sullivan, he also made public statements last fall in opposition to the mine. So we are feeling very good about his ability to come on board. Congressman Young is a bit of a wild card. He is very pro states' rights, certainly, and pro mineral development, but he also for a long time has said publicly, well, if you don't think we should mine it, then you should pay us. So that's what we're hoping to do. So we'll see. I think there may be a way to work with him to try to get him on board. In order to be successful in the Senate, this really is going to require a national push. And we're thinking about who some of the other senators are, based on the committees and such, that would be critical to have them on board early and early supporters of the bill. And so that's one of the things we're working on right now.
Great, thank you, Steve. Two connected questions, talking about TNC's work. Candace Page asks, can you talk a little bit more about your land acquisition protection efforts north and south of the Pebble Mine site and how they are going? And then a question from Paul Fusco, that just came in. You mentioned national parks. Is that an option for Bristol Bay?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. We last summer we were approached by one of the tribal governments that had purchased a property several years ago on Cook Inlet. Cook Inlet is the sort of the water body between Anchorage, the port of Anchorage, and the Alaska Peninsula. And in order to build a mine, there would need to be a port facility built on Cook Inlet, and then an access road and a pipeline to the mine itself further inland. And this village government had approached us. They owned a property that they had bought strategically, which has long been identified as the really only viable port for the main access route to the mine. And they had an intention, when they purchased the property, an intention of securing that and making it unavailable for future mineral development for the Pebble Mine. The challenge is, when they bought the property, there were certain outstanding rights that at the time they simply didn't have the resources to acquire. Rights dealing with the use of the property as a port, and certain rock quarrying rights, which they were very concerned were a liability, because if the retainer of those rights were to sell those to Pebble, it would basically open up that back door and make it possible for that site to be used as a port. And so they were very concerned. They approached us to see if we might be able to help to acquire those rights, and we did. We were able to raise funds. We provided a grant to the tribal government, and they successfully acquired those rights. So I think that was a really good example of how strategically it's possible to put up some roadblocks in front of the development that make it less and less viable. The Conservation Fund has entered into a contract with an Alaska Native corporation that owns substantial property between that port site I mentioned and the proposed mine. They've entered into a contract to purchase a conservation easement on that property. Again, a further roadblock to the project. And then there's another potential route to the mine that could go around the south end of Lake Iliamna, which is a major lake in between the port site and the mine, that basically have to go around. And that community on the south end of the lake is looking at how they can acquire, the tribal government is looking about ways to acquire private land and then make them unavailable to development using tribal law under a tribal ordinance. So there's lots of different permutations and options being considered, but all towards the same end of continuing to throw up hurdles in front of this mine, making it less and less viable, and really trying to tilt the playing field in favor of protection. So it's a multi-pronged strategy, but sort of all these pieces are working together.
You mentioned sort of, the indigenous partnerships and community development. And so there's a question here from William Hayes, and I'd like to ask it, but also, he asks, are there other similar Pebble Mine projects lurking out there to impact Bristol Bay? Assume full-time vigilance is required. Is this a whack-a-mole situation? But also putting that in the context of how you work with indigenous communities, the Alaska Native corporations, and how that goes both with Pebble Mine and other projects. And a situation that's different than here in the lower 48, how similar fights might go, and what makes one of the many things that makes Alaska unique and special.
Yeah, and it comes back to an earlier question of, would this area be suitable as a national park? I think we are looking at much larger than the Pebble deposit. The measure that I've been talking about would be more at a landscape scale, and commensurate with the level of compensation that would be considered through some kind of federal legislation. It's very intentional to prevent sort of that whack-a-mole problem, and to look to protect an entire watershed rather than just a more narrow focus around the Pebble deposit itself. But also, I think it's very purposeful on our part, and this is really coming from local leadership. They're not looking to live in a park. They have uses for the land that are tied to community development, and that are very compatible with the long-term conservation of this area, but would still allow for certain kinds of surface use activities that are needed from a community perspective. So it is a different model of conservation. We're looking to address the threat of the mine, but also recognize that local people have interests in the use of land, and it's not, they would not see it in their interest to make land unavailable, say for future economic or use activities in ways that would inhibit their community development. So that's kind of, we're really following their lead on that and their desires to address the threats, but also to maintain their opportunities for the future.
Great. Slight change of question, not specific to Pebble Mine, but really about Bristol Bay. T. Stephen Jones asks, has climate change associated higher temperatures affected the Bristol Bay salmon run? And again, that's outside just the specifics of Pebble Mine, but people have heard about the warm blob there and some of the other challenges. And so it's sort of, even if you're successful in permanently defeating Pebble Mine, are there these other threats that are still there that TNC Alaska has to work on?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and there's a lot of unknowns there. We don't really know how changing ocean conditions or changing temperature regimes on the terrestrial side will impact species like salmon. We have seen some pretty dramatic swings in recent years. We've seen whole populations of different species of salmon in different runs, particularly further north in the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers, where king salmon or Chinook salmon runs are greatly depressed. And we don't know exactly what's causing that. And it's probably a combination of factors: overfishing, bycatch, disease in that population, but also changing ocean conditions due to climate change, whether that's warming or acidification. So for sure, we are very concerned about changing ocean conditions and how that's going to impact fisheries in Alaska. And we're not alone in that. There's a lot of science and research going into that. State, federal agencies are very concerned, and I think the most concerned people of all are the people who depend on those fisheries, either for commercial use or for subsistence. And so, we are certainly part of that, looking into those issues, and part of I would say, a much broader coalition of folks that are concerned about climate change and how that's going to affect Alaska's lands and waters and the abundance and distribution of fish and wildlife.
Thanks for that. Another question that's kind of connected to that, bringing back climate change's impact on salmon population health. An attendee asks about the regulatory framework in terms of water quality, groundwater, surface water, and contamination of land from mining. And sort of asking the connection between state and federal regulation of salmon population health. It seemed like it would be obvious. You'd have these stringent high standards combined with maybe this additional threat of climate change. Is that increasing threat does it or should it, create even higher standards for green lighting a mine or having opposition to mines because you have the threat level is that much higher overall.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one of the things that we looked at when the permit was going through its final phase. This was in the last fall. The way that the development was proposed, the scale of it, it's a very large open pit in a very wet area, and so we were very concerned that that pit would effectively create like a sponge that would soak up groundwater from all the surrounding drainages, and so the footprint of that mine would be much bigger than just its immediate footprint of the actual development and the pit itself. And so that was we were kind of gearing up very much to be part of the coalition that would fight the permit on science around those impacts. TNC also, we did something kind of interesting starting about 20 years ago. My hat's off to the visionary leadership from 20 years ago that sort of saw what was coming with the Pebble Mine and began a process to acquire in-stream flow rights for streams surrounding the Pebble deposit. And we had a number of partners who participated in that. And it's a very lengthy process with the state. It literally took us about 20 years to acquire those in-stream flow rights. And to date, TNC is the only private organization in Alaska that has successfully gone through that entire adjudication process with the state. But what that means is we have a deeded property right to keep water in the stream for the purpose of sustaining fisheries for streams that could potentially be impacted by this larger development. So that was one approach, is an approach that we still kind of keep in our back pocket. If through some terrible turn of circumstances, the mine permitting process were to restart, we're prepared to go to court to defend those rights, and would look to additional science to make sure we could draw that connection between the impacts to groundwater and how that might affect our rights. And in that we'd have a number of other partners also looking to do the same thing. So I do think better understanding that the science and the connection between groundwater and surface water and impacts to fish and wildlife, and then the interface between that science and sort of the policy and legal dimensions has been a part of our long-term strategy.
Great. I'll sort of close with a comment here from Murray Rosenberg, and then Steve, I'll turn it over to you. I mean, he says, for those unaware of the potential risk and impact of these mines, there are numerous mine sites in the Western US and Alaska that have become EPA Superfund sites. These sites have resulted in long-term habitat loss, require costly long-term investigation, monitoring, and remediation, often leaving behind residual contamination. EPA and other public websites have extensive info describing the issues and concerns associated with these sites, making it clear that the Pebble Mine should never be developed. So I think that's well said. Steve, we're approaching the end of our time today. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share, and maybe to our listeners how they can help out?
Yeah, again, I want to thank everyone for participating today. I welcome you all to come to Alaska, to come out to Bristol Bay or the Tongass, or just to see our state. I think, having lived here now for a number of years, really seeing what Alaska is and what Alaska offers to the world, I do feel like this is an exceptional and special place, and a place that has meaning for all of us. And so I would encourage you all to come when you can, or to just do what you can to help in our conservation efforts, whether that's calling up your member of Congress or writing an editorial in your local paper. But staying engaged, staying active, I think that's what's going to help us to secure a place that has national, global significance and is going to require people from literally around the world to come together and to try to do what we can to protect this important place. So again, I want to thank you all for taking the time. Looking forward to engaging further. Our team is available anytime if you want to chat about our strategy, want to talk about ways that you can get engaged. We're more than happy to communicate. So please feel free to reach out. And again, Dan, thank you so much. And thank you to the Massachusetts team for helping to pull this event together. We really appreciate it, and for giving us the time to share a little bit about our work here in Alaska.
Happy to. Always great to hear about Alaska. Steve, thank you for that illuminating presentation, your answers to the questions, and thank you to everyone who tuned in for your support of the Nature Conservancy. Your support is what makes all of this work that Steve just described possible. We will be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources we talked about today and a recording of this webinar. If you're enjoying our webinars, please share them with your friends, more the merrier. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. As always, you can see our upcoming webinars and sign up at nature.org/MA webinars. Join us on August 19th for part 2 of our summer series about TNC's work in Alaska. Steve mentioned that before. Crystal Nelson, a Tlingit tribal member and TNC's community development specialist for the Emerald Edge, and Christine Wall, TNC's Southeast Alaska program director, will talk about a new initiative called the Seacoast Trust. This new coalition of tribes, Alaska Native corporations, and conservation and community development nonprofits is working to ensure Southeast Alaska Native communities are empowered to achieve healthy and vibrant communities and economies in tandem with the conservation of nature. You won't want to miss it, especially if you enjoyed today. I think sort of as a follow-up, a two-parter really gives a great perspective on all that TNC is doing in Alaska and the many challenges facing up there and how well TNC is meeting them. So thanks again to Steve for his time today in the morning in Alaska, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Please have a wonderful afternoon.